Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about abolition versus reform. And this is a pretty large topic that intersects with so many different subjects, and which means there are a lot of angles we could tackle this from. So in this first part of the video, we're going to review some history, just because that informs so much of the abolitionist position. So the first period I would like to highlight is colonial America. And prisons and jails during this time weren't really used as punishment, but actually just temporary holding cells while people awaited their actual punishment or their trial. Two exceptions to this were political prisoners and debtors. Both those classes of people were kept in jails for prolonged periods. And the main form of punishment during this time were fines if you were wealthy and forms of corporal punishment if you were not. And the death penalty applied to a lot of crimes, over 200 by the mid 18th century. Other forms of punishment during this time include public shaming, flogging, exile, things like that. And the main system of punishment was mainly confined to white people during this time, and that's because the main forms of racialized criminalization were geared towards African slaves and indigenous people, and those forms of criminality were faced with other responses. In the case of African slaves, it was mainly private violent responses from slave owners. In the case of indigenous people, it was the justification for erasure in the forms of genocide and other supposed civilizing projects. And so, the first prison that we're most familiar with, it wasn't built until 1829 in Pennsylvania by Quakers. And the goal was actually a more humane way to deal with crime compared to corporal punishment and the death penalty. And these prisons, right from the start, were marked with serious issues, starting with overcrowding that then led to problems related to health, corruption, and violence. And fast forward to after the Civil War and the passing of the 13th and 14th Amendment. And the first thing I'd like to highlight about this period is the actual text of the 13th Amendment. As you can see, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So right off the bat, at the heart of Emancipation and Reconstruction, we have a glaring exception to this abolition of slavery, which is you can be subject to involuntary servitude if you have been convicted of a crime. And so there were many different responses to emancipation and Reconstruction, and we're going to go through them. The first is black codes, and these are a set of criminal codes targeted for recently freed black people. These were things that criminalized they were petty offenses, and they criminalized usually regular or normal behavior, things that weren't previously criminalized, and they were only crimes if black people did them. Examples include mischief, insulting gestures, cruel treatment of animals, cohabitating with whites, and keeping firearms. The upshot of these kinds of black codes were the explosion of the prison population and the changing demographics. So, for example, in Alabama, the state's prison population was 1% black in 1850, but a mere 5 years later, it was 75% black. And by the late 1880s, it was 85% black. And this also held true for northern states, even though northern states were perceived to be more progressive and abolished slavery much earlier. This same racial disparity in imprisonment was also true of those states as well. The second one that I clicked a little too soon on here is convict leasing. This was this allowed private citizens to pay for prison labor, mainly to work in agriculture, at very, very low prices. And so much of the Southern economy obviously still Southern economy pre-Civil War relied on plantation labor. The Southern economy post-Civil War still relied on agriculture as its main production, and imprisonment and paying very small amounts of money for prison labor was a natural substitute for slave labor. The third one is Jim Crow laws, and this is the codification of formal segregation. So these were literal laws that were written down and that they established when whites and blacks could cohabitate and certain forms of criminal conduct. One of the most famous ones is the outline of interracial marriage and things of that nature. So that when we say Jim Crow laws, we mean the formal legal codification of segregation. The next response I want to talk about is lynchings. From 1882 to 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the United States. Black people were made up 73% of those people. And lynchings were frequently committed with the most flagrant public display, like executions by guillotine in medieval times, for an example. Lynchings were often advertised in newspapers and drew large crowds from white families. And according to the Equal Justice Initiative, nearly 25% of lynching victims were accused of sexual assault and nearly 30% were accused of murder. The note about sexual assault is important because one of the main driving forces of lynching in the minds of white people was the fact that white women need to be protected from these hypersexualized black people, black men specifically, and this kind of trope still continues on to this day. And also, according to the Equal Justice Initiative, all lynchings committed after 1900, only 1% resulted in a lyncher being convicted of a criminal offense of any kind. Never for the actual murder, but never for the actual murder, but usually just other things like arson or other minor offenses due to formulating a mob or whatever. But it was never actually people convicted of lynching. The other response, migration and urbanization. This is referring to the fact that black people both migrated from the South to the North and the West, mainly to cities, and then also within the South, they migrated from rural areas to urban areas in the South. And this kind of response for black people trying to flee these Jim Crow laws and these forms of racialized terror in the forms of lynchings and mobs and things were met with white race riots. A lot of people, when they hear about race riots in America, they generally think about the 60s as one, and they maybe think of some of these social unrest as mainly peaceful, like there were like people were doing peaceful protests and then police responded with brutality or whatnot. But it's better to center race riots as in terms of a starting period in the 1870s, and the people who started them were Southern whites reacting to black advancement. And there are so many examples. The Meridian, Mississippi race riot, 1871, Colfax massacre in Louisiana in 1873, New Orleans in 1866, Memphis, 1866, Charleston, South Carolina in 1876, Wilmington, South Carolina in 1898. And, this process of white race riots continued for decades. One of the most notable, the summer of 1919, it was known as the Red Summer because 26 cities had episodes of racial violence. And the main drivers were the fact that black veterans were returning from World War I, and they were perceived as a big threat to the legitimacy and the sustainability of Jim Crow laws and formal segregation. There are other examples that continue closer to the present. In 1921, the Greenwood riot, the entire black neighborhood of Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was known as Black Wall Street at the time, was burned to the ground. And the key takeaway from this period of history is that a generation, barely even a generation after slavery, these free black people were faced with formal segregation and legally condoned racial violence that was specifically targeted to suppress wealth creation, economic mobility, and the practicing of freedom. And it has been no time at all since any remedy was advanced to this problem, let alone one that was sufficient, which really has not occurred in the United States. So Reconstruction in the United States was basically short-circuited, and it was replaced by this system of racialized violence and Jim Crow laws and segregation and things of that nature. And the procedural response in the 60s to extend civil rights never really spoke to and never extended to the point of rectifying this kind of legacy of legally condoned racial violence and this massive suppression of wealth creation in certain minority communities. And that fact kind of extends to this day. There was never that more direct reconciliation with those bigger causes and harms. But as we kind of alluded to, the 1960s it can be classified as kind of a period of rebellion and unrest. And what I mean by that is, certain groups, nationalist groups, Marxist groups like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, they began arming themselves. So there were continuous race riots, but in places like Newark, Watts, and Chicago, it was a two-way a two-way street. So black people began shooting back at cops in the National Guard. In Detroit, there were these urban hillbillies, poor white Southerners who had been displaced by the mechanization of agriculture that also fought alongside black people. There are other examples, trans women, drag queens, gay men fought the cops who came to raid the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, and there was obviously a lot more unrest in terms of other forms of more peaceful protests, and there was also more a channeling of energy and like legal channels. Women organized, filed successful lawsuits, and staged large protests against discrimination. And every summer from 1964 through the mid 1970s saw a riot season in which multiple major American cities were racked with massive, violent, spontaneous uprisings where it was mostly but not exclusively unemployed and underemployed African American youth that were the driving force. And cops were shot, commercial districts were looted and burned, and all of this was captured on TV. And one of the major commissions at the time, in 1967, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, founded that in every single case, the precipitating cause of the riots were police brutality. And furthermore, the commission found that police tactical incompetence usually made things worse. And so this was kind of a setting, and what the government response was mainly a crackdown instead of a investment in reconciliation with the driving causes, one of which was massive unemployment and underemployment and barriers to wealth creation in minority communities. Part of the crackdown includes 1968, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, which was geared towards, this is kind of one of the laws that help promote what you commonly understand as the police department in the status quo, which is a more militarized form of policing, a more standardized form of policing. This is what integrated technology into police departments, what integrated more weaponry, because the main goal of this law was to adopt more counterinsurgent tactics in policing, because what police needed to respond to was social unrest in urban settings, which required, borrowing from military paradigms like counterinsurgency tactics and equipment. And so, in the next 10 years since 1968, the government spent over $1 billion rationalizing and retooling state law enforcement. And then in 1971, Nixon formally declared a war on drugs. And if you wanted to get what was really behind the motivation, the chief of staff of Nixon, H.R. Haldeman, put in his diary, the president emphasized that you have to face that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to, which is pretty much all you got to say about Nixon's, tough on crime law enforcement style policies. The next era I want to talk about is the Reagan era. And this is an area that is the beginning of the neoliberal period. And so I want to talk about some of the drivers of what was going on economically, and then how criminal justice folded into that ordering. So the issue at the time was that profits for business began sagging in 1966 and continued to decline until 1974. And this was because of overaccumulation. Overaccumulation means there was too much capital, too much stuff, not enough outlets of consumption to manage it all. And what really freaked people out during this time was the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve is this idea that when unemployment goes up, wages should go down. And that kind of makes sense. If unemployment is up, that means a lot of people don't have jobs. That means it should be easy to find people to work for you, and you don't have to pay them less because people are competing for jobs and there's more labor. And so, when the supply of something goes up, the price of it should go down. And so, but the issue was in the 1970s, both unemployment and wages were increasing. And people referred to this as stagflation. And, people had different ideas for why this was going on. But the one that had the most political power behind it was the fact that from the New Deal through the 1970s, the government was heavily involved in the economy, which cost business through taxation and regulation. And so this was also compounded by the peak of the organized labor movement in the 1970s. The late 1960s, early 1970s faced a lot of labor unrest. There were a lot of work stoppages, a lot of strikes, and unions generally, there was unions in all kinds of industries, and they generally won. They usually won, and they usually resulted in wage increases and concessions from, capital and bosses and things of that nature. So there needed to be a solution to this. Things were costing way too much money. Labor had way too much power. Profits were high, and so what was the solution? And so the solution that was devised was a cold bath recession. The Federal Reserve increased interest rates in 79 and 81, and they went as high as 16.4%. Interest rates, that's, about 5 times higher than what they are like right now. This dramatically cut off borrowing and buying power, which caused a recession. This was kind of the biggest recession since the Great Depression. And, if you wanted to know what the motivation behind it was, the chairman of the Federal Reserve was Paul Volcker, and he told the New York Times that the standard of living of the average American has to decline. I don't think you can escape that. And so it's just so wild that someone said in the 1980s that, standards of living and they have too much money and they have too much quality of life, and it has to go down because it's just costing too much money. And so the Federal Reserve monetary policy was complemented by cuts to the welfare state. In 1982 alone, Reagan cut welfare by 24%, the real value of welfare by 24%, slashed the budget for child nutrition, school milk programs, urban development, education block grants, all cut all over 20%. And, unions were also cracked down on. In 1980, there was not a single union contract that included a pay cut or a pay freeze even, where there were no pay raises. Every union contract included a pay raise. But in 1982, only 1 year into Reagan, 44% of new contracts included wage cuts or freezes. And so this is when working class standards of living basically plateaued, in the late 70s. And it's never quite been the same since. And the way criminal justice played a role in all of this was the fact that what we had going on here was a structural adjustment. And criminal justice's job was to secure it. And it did this by masking the real causes of poverty, generally with racist fear-mongering and victim blaming. Generally in this period, it was related to drug use, as well as keeping communities fragmented and tied up in the criminal justice system, harassed by the criminal justice system. It also secured central cities for gentrification and development. So in other words, what criminal justice did in this time was regulate, absorb, terrorize, and disorganize the poor. And at the same time, it, promoted politically useful racism. And so the criminal justice crackdown in kind of the overuse of incarceration, allowed capitalism to have the positive effects of mass unemployment, which is it kept wages low and it disorganized labor without any of the destabilization that mass poverty can bring. Usually mass poverty should bring social unrest, riots, and things of that nature. But criminal justice, instead of, having a robust social safety net, incarceration and militarized policing absorbed the poor and working class people without empowering them or subsidizing their rebellion, which is how it worked in the 60s and 70s. And I'd like to kind of go over some of the timeline of events. 1983, is when the Correction Corporation of America is founded. They are the first and currently the largest contemporary private prison corporation. In 1984, the federal crime bill establishes asset forfeiture, which allows 90% of drug-tainted property to be seized by the police. 1986, Anti-Drug Abuse Act establishes mandatory minimums that have wide racial disparities in them. 1993, the Three Strikes Law is passed in Washington State and then copied by a lot of the other states to see who is toughest on crime. And then in 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which is kind of a modernization and update of the 1968 law that we talked about previously. So, this is the starting point for a lot of the abolitionist position because criminal justice and punishment are seen as political projects used to exploit and oppress the poor and those deemed racialized. And the specifics of the system change, but the goal never seems to change when you track history from, just the founding of the nation, the colonial period, to the Civil War, to after the Civil War, to industrialization, to the 60s, 70s, and the neoliberal period that started, in the late 70s that we currently live in today. And I want to tackle the criminal justice system from another angle, and that is one of statistics. And so we're going to go through just some of the images and some of the ways to think about the criminal justice system. And the first graphic you see here is police kill a disproportionate number of black people. They're 13% of the population, but 31% of the people who are killed by police. The most unarmed victims of police killings are more likely to be minorities. Minorities make up, you can see on the left-hand side, they make up a smaller part of the general population, but an oversized portion of those unarmed victims of police killings. Illicit drug use. 9.5% white, 10.5% black. But drug-related arrests are orders of magnitude higher for black people. The percent of stop drivers by police. You can see that Hispanic and black drivers are more likely to be stopped by the police in traffic or when driving. Another graphic of drug-related arrests by race. Plea offer types of felonies. And you can kind of see here at the bottom, it's jail, prison, community service, fine, time served, and other. And the most frequent thing offered to black defendants is jail and prison. And there are a million different statistics, a million different contexts of the criminal justice system, but over and over, there's a racial disparity. And this is kind of, again, part of the abolitionist critique, where you combine it with all of these different, there's two phenomena going on here. One is the fact that reform generally offers technical or procedural solutions. And no matter how you kind of slice it, no matter the procedural or technical configurations of the criminal justice system, these sorts of racial disparities seem to always pop up. And the second one is, as it relates to the history argument we were making previously, is it makes sense why this keeps happening, because the foundation and the purpose of the criminal justice system was never, everyone is equal, there's some kind of ideal that is being protected, it doesn't center the most vulnerable, but rather it's a political project, generally antagonistic it's antagonistic towards the vast majority of people that need to be subjugated for kind of ruling class power to sustain itself. Black people similarly don't get to be included in juries. A massive disparity. And so we need, you know, certainly the prisons and criminal justice system we have now has a lot of issues. And what the abolition debate is going to boil down to in these debates is it's the other side is never going to be like, oh no, the status quo is totally sustainable, it's great, we should just keep going. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be more of the case where the other side is going to grant a lot of premises, but then try to slice a very small part that is defensible. And one of the things is, in theory, you could possibly imagine police doing something to resolve crime in a not racist way, in theory. And so one of the things that's going to quickly be present in these debates is a theoretical discussion of crime and police. And so we need to interrogate that a little bit more. Because ultimately people want to have police because, well, they want to have police. We've already kind of talked about why they actually want to have police in some respects. But in theory, if you were designing a society from scratch, you would say, crime costs a lot. I would like to have some kind of solution to that. And, for a long time, people have defaulted to the punishment paradigm. Like we talked about in colonial period, it was just different. There were still police, but they generally apprehended you, and then there was corporal or capital punishments that related to that. So this is a graphic that helps explain kind of the overall scope of thinking about crime, because there's obviously a lot of things that go into crime and the consequences of crime, but there are a lot of costs that go into it. As you can see, anticipation of crime, the direct consequences of crime, and response to crime. And there's obviously it's really tough when you're trying to get the total cost of crime about how much it is. It's easily hundreds of billions of dollars, and it could extend, depending on how you think about it, to trillions of dollars as you try to factor in everything that is crime related. So, a society without crime would definitely, there'd be a lot of extra value added to that proposition. But the question then becomes, does policing do anything to reduce this? And there are a couple theories of punishment. And the main one we're going to talk about here is the utilitarian one. And the utilitarian theory of punishment says you punish crimes to deter others from committing crimes, or you deter the person from committing a crime again. So it's all based around deterrence. And there's two levels of deterrence. General deterrence, it means that punishment should prevent other people from committing criminal acts. The punishment serves as an example to the rest of society, and it puts others on notice that criminal behavior will be punished. And then the other kind of deterrence is specific deterrence, which means that the punishment should prevent the same person from committing the crime again. So that's the idea. And so now we need to look at some of the evidence about whether that idea actually works. And there are some problems. The first is that there's been several large government and non-government reviews of major studies about whether, what contributes to the reduction of crime. And the studies reviewed found that it was not really the case that the severity of the punishment mattered, but what mattered was the odds that a criminal was going to be apprehended. So generally speaking, if you could get someone to internalize the idea that if they commit a crime, there's 100% risk that they were going to get caught, then generally there would be very little crime. But the fact that people face harsh sentences, and a lot of studies have been done like this in the context of the death penalty, they do not deter crimes with the severity of punishments. And so micropolitical studies also kind of support this, where they did limited experiments, limited social science experiments on whether the severity of the punishment changed people's decision making. And also, when researchers look at countries comparatively, and one country has more severe punishments and another country has less severe punishments, it's not the case that the less severe country has way more crime. So it doesn't dampen a deterrent effect. And then the kind of third problem with this is what this graph shows is reductions in the imprisonment rate and crime rate. So generally speaking, and what this shows, this is a plotting of the 50 states as they kind of change from 2008 to 2013. And what you see is really no trend. If it was the case that, this is interrogating the reverse, that if more policing was supposed to deter more crime, then as you take away from that, there should be less crime. But as you can see, that's not really what is happening. There is no clear example. There was kind of a natural experiment on this in New York City. In 2014, the police can't really go on strike. Like the police union can't go on strike. It's against the law. But so they did was they slowed down police operations to a dramatic extent. It was like said that a cop shouldn't even leave their car unless they absolutely had to or they thought it was absolutely necessary. So it was basically like cops were there and they weren't doing anything, and they told everybody that they weren't really going to do anything, even though they weren't formally on strike. And this kind of went on from 2014 to 2015, and there was no increase in crime. It wasn't like a free for all. It wasn't actually crime went down in New York City during this time. And so that kind of just shows that you would think if the deterrence theory is true, then the inverse, if you took away policing, there should be way more crime. But that's not really what happens. The other utilitarian justification for like why punishment and policing can deter crime is you take a criminal and you rehabilitate them. But this is generally not how it works. Any kind of analysis of recidivism in our current system shows that, this is a chart that shows the odds of getting rearrested or the percentage of people who got rearrested. And, so you can see that over 40% got rearrested in the first year, and it accumulated to over 80% of them got rearrested by the 9th year. So almost, all of these released prisoners, over 80% of them got rearrested within the first 10 years. It's not like a lot of the prisoners never commit another crime. And there's a lot of reasons for that we're going to kind of talk about more when we talk about alternatives to policing and things of that nature. So now, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the specific case against reform. And there are kind of 4 arguments that have kind of been alluded to in the previous sections. The first relates to deontology, and there's kind of 2 flavors of this argument. The first is that caging is inhumane, and confinement that limits people's human rights and their freedoms is a dehumanizing way to go about doing things. So how can one justify a prison if that is true? And that's kind of just the basic it. It's just like it's inhumane to cage people. Society should not put people in cages, basically. Which isn't to say that kind of view doesn't necessarily rule out all forms of punishment or all forms of policing, but it is a very deontological case against prison specifically. And then a more general deontological argument is kind of against criminal justice generally, which is if things evolve from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, how can the system be redeemed? What is its virtue? Why would it matter? It's all poison fruit. It all kind of stems from this rotten core, and it should just be rejected. The second set of arguments is about co-option and legitimacy. And these notions are reforms are going to be the minimum necessary. It's not going to be a transformational set of reforms. And also it's about circumvention, which is the same result is going to be pursued through different means. And you can kind of see this with the persistent racial disparities, despite reforms that were designed and targeted for those. All of these racial disparities and all these kinds of new forms of getting to the same end pop up. And then there are trade-offs. It reduces political pressure for change. It makes people think things are all right. It kind of it blunts momentum and things of that nature. The next argument I want to talk about is net widening. And so this is the idea that the reform for the criminal justice system actually makes it kind of more permanent and extends its reach in just a different way. And the thrust of this argument is that the social control of things deemed deviant is the main issue with the criminal justice system, not really the exact specifics of the punishment bureaucracy. So generally speaking, reforms promote new forms of surveillance and professional classes to manage people. This could include, social workers or kind of mandatory drug treatment, drug courts, and things of that nature, which are trying to lessen the severity of the criminal justice system. It kind of keeps the criminal justice system centered, keeps prosecutors or judges or police kind of the main arbiters of who gets to do what. There's still a large deal of coercion and things of that, things of that nature in the process. And then the last one I want to talk about is mystification. And this is the idea that criminal justice reform kind of masks or distorts what is really the issue. And the problem is, like we've talked about, social control and the ideologies that drive it. And the issue is that reforms promote a narrow focus on things like punishment, which obscure the animating force of the police and the carceral power, which, can be classified as like racial antagonism or maintaining class power and things of that nature, where the criminal justice system has come up with all kinds of sorts of alternatives, that are supposed to be softer. A classic example is drug courts, but it still seems to be the paradigm of social control still seems to be largely intact. And then it accepts certain things as given and promotes, technical or procedural approaches instead of structural ones, and accepts problematic givens, And this is just where you need to view things in the totality of the way the carceral state and the punishment system relates to other things in society instead of having too narrow of a focus, or where the reforms kind of beg the question of like why are those things the way they are in the first place? Like, why are police dealing with homelessness, and why is their only response to either make them move or to put them in jail when society should have a broader conversation? So it's not a question of like, oh yeah, police should be trained to figure out how to deal with homeless people. That's not how it should work. The next part of this I want to talk about is the alternatives to policing and prisons that are generally proposed. And one of the key things that's going to decide some of these debates is what people mean by abolition and what they are strictly defending. Because, there's a spectrum of things that fit within the paradigm, and you can defend lots of them, and you can defend a lot of things are compatible, and there's lots of different ways you could have alternatives to it. And you could be general or specific. You could promote, for instance, more de-escalatory interventions, which tells you that they're not the current model of policing, but it doesn't tell you a lot of things could be included in that. So I'm interested to see if there's going to be some kind of like procedural, like we need some details so we can have a reasonable debate about abolition. And you can kind of see this present in like if you Google, the last articles from the last 2 months. Is just everyone's like, what does it mean? Like, what is happening? I just don't like what do people mean when they say this? But there's some themes and alternatives to policing. One is prevention over punishment, and this is usually a couple of things. One is unarmed mediation and intervention teams. These exist in places like Detroit and Los Angeles, where you're trying to resolve the situation and deal with making the victim whole and kind of rectifying the situation. And there are other emphasis like investing in the root causes, transferring things from police budgets to social policy. There's lots of things that have been said to reduce crime, making more green spaces in cities, reducing the amount of lead, changing alcohol consumption patterns, increasing access to healthcare, reproductive healthcare, increasing education, increasing employment, obviously, and things like reducing poverty and things of that nature. There's also de-escalation, which is a kind of the similar thing to prevention over punishment, which is just like people who are sanctioned by the state to use force should not be the responders in a lot of situations. They shouldn't be the ones who pull you over. They shouldn't be the ones dealing with episodes of mental health. They shouldn't be the ones to deal with um, the homeless and things of that nature. So there should be more de-escalatory. Use of force should be entirely off the table or a thing of absolute last resort. In a lot of countries, cops don't even, walk around with guns. A lot of cops don't have firearms. There's other things that go into this, decriminalizing a lot of nonviolent offenses, drug possession, and things like that. Um, Another example is restorative justice. And, there are some examples like this have occurred in US cities like Philadelphia with community courts. Canada has a lot of things that are about this, and Ireland, South Africa, dealing with previous periods of violence and oppression, kind of use restorative justice to move to help improve those situations. And the idea is just kind of a different philosophy of punishment, behind the fact that it's not about, society, people, there's more things, people are not atomized individuals. There's a society takes responsibility for, for inducing certain things. It's not like people's actions are totally determined by society. It's a question of making things whole, respecting the victim's rights and trying to give them justice, but also trying just to make things whole, like we talked about, kind of with unarmed mediation and things of that nature. And so that's kind of like what I was talking about with, like, there's kind of like you can have a theory of justice and a theory of punishment, and certain things flow. A lot of things can fit under those umbrella, and the question will be, how specific are people going to defend their details and the alternative, because it's kind of easy, like we've talked about. There's lots of ways to tackle saying reform is bad. There's a lot of ways to problematize this current system of criminal justice, but a key part of the other team responding is going to lie in some of these details. These discussions are a little less substantive back and forth in the abstract, and so it'll be curious to see how that plays out during the season. The other big one is, like we talked about, unbundling, which is just having police do way less. They shouldn't be doing social work. They shouldn't be mental health responders. Some people are saying they shouldn't even be traffic regulators. They also enforce a lot of municipal codes for businesses. They work on behalf of business, and people said that people who are armed with guns should not be the ones who do those kinds of things. So in this final section, we're going to talk about some responses to abolition. And because this exists this could be AF, this could be NAG. It's unclear exactly what side you're going to be when you're having to resolve abolition. We're going to talk about this in a few different angles. The first is, can you imagine a role for the police in society? And like I talked about earlier, it's not like you're going to totally defend the status quo and say police are doing a great job, but rather you're going to say that they are, you're going to grant a lot of the premises and then try to just find, like a pick. You're going to find the least objectionable thing that the police could end up doing. And so in this example, definitely have them do less stuff. They should do way less stuff. They should not be doing less stuff. Means decriminalizing stuff, making much more stuff legal, reducing the over criminalization of things, but then also not having police antagonize people or risk contact or be entangled in the criminal justice system and things of that nature. So they should do way less stuff, like get other people doing. So first responders should be different, traffic responders should be different, dealing with domestic abuse or sexual assault and things of that nature. You can, and the big idea behind that is you should make public health be kind of the driving paradigm for response and shape your policies that way. And that would way de-emphasize the role of police or whatever. You would also definitely change the structure of the job. Qualified immunity, gone. A bunch shouldn't have guns. They definitely shouldn't have tanks. They definitely shouldn't have SWAT. A lot of the militarized police stuff, that should all be gone. Do they need guns? Kind of an open debate. Probably not. A lot of them don't. You can get rid of a lot of the guns. Maybe have them make liability insurance or something about accountability where, use of force is serious. It's a super last resort, only specific contexts. Try to create a mechanism where, there isn't this foot dragging or kind of deferring to cops. You know, they can't um, prove their claim of why the use of force was necessary or that they exhausted all available alternatives. But you can kind of picture a role for deterring crime, like we talked about. Deterring crime involves making sure people know that they're apprehended, so they don't commit crime. It seems reasonable to say that people will try to commit crimes, no matter how you know just having like more generous social policy and things of that nature. People will still probably commit crimes, and having a law enforcement agency that's whose goal is to apprehend criminals. A lot of crimes in the United States don't go. A lot of them don't go reported. A lot of them don't go. Um, they don't find the person who did it. They don't try and convict them and things of that nature. So if you invested law enforcement resources into figuring out how to do that in a reasonable way, that could reduce crime. And that crime, there we already talked about the cost of crime that are problematic. And that could be a reasonable thing for police to do. Some crimes are not, you're not going to be able to prevent them all. You're not going to be able to see everything that happens. And some ex post investigative capacity could be good. And then, there might be a super limited role for incapacitation as well as the last resort. Um, for just if there's some people who that is the best way to protect public safety. That's like the only reason that prisons exist. But you can change the way prisons work. Prisons in the Scandinavian countries are kind of more akin to college dorms or apartments, and they don't have to. You can resolve the confinement and kind of the violation of human rights. Where in Spain, people commit murder, and I think the maximum sentence is 7 years. And other folks in like Finland, they have um, way more freedoms and resource, and it's just like the basic paradigm is they're still people, and that entails a floor of basic provisions and rights and things of that nature. So it looks a lot different. The next bucket of stuff I want to talk about is incrementalism. And, I'm still exploring the exact way of how intricate or nuanced the defense of incrementalism get. But the basic paradigm here is that the main thrust of the idea is don't hold people hostage. So if I said we should just like let everyone who is in jail for a drug offense, you should let them out of jail because jails are bad. And you said we should just abolish all kinds of prisons. And this is kind of like in the context of debate, it's interesting just because like fiat colors a lot of this because it's like, oh yeah, you can just fiat get rid of all of them. But if you were thinking, a lot of this literature is driven by limited scope of political power, limited bandwidth, having to prioritize certain things. And so the more clear comparison is, should you let people out of, if you had the opportunity to let, a fraction of the people out of prison today for nonviolent offenses, would you do so for, and the cost benefit calculation is you could be hurting the chances for long-term abolition. Obviously, you can't really calculate it to any precise degree, and you don't know when or if that thing is ever going to happen. And most people just say, it's fine. We should definitely just let them out of prison. And we know that, the pressure needs to stay on. We need to convince more people, and we need to figure out how to reach decarceration on a massive scale. But, we should definitely let them get out of prison just because it's a question of harm reduction. And so, part of the issue speaks to movement tactics of how exactly can reforms build and accumulate in a way that help the next reform become more likely, or do you kind of need to reached this critical mass of anger and an inflection point where there's so many demands for change and there's so many different people that kind of a structural shift happens kind of all at once. And there's not, a kind of example that a lot of you have lived through is, healthcare, where the 2008 election was dominated by, a chunk of it was dedicated to healthcare and reforming it. It cost too much. And the Affordable Care Act at the time, it involved huge Democratic Congresses that had not been seen for quite a while. And the Affordable Care Act is one of kind of the more it's kind of the biggest, kind of more it's one of the biggest, most complicated, kind of far-reaching laws that has been passed in recent memory, but it is definitely an incremental approach to healthcare reform. And there's been a lot of issues with it, and there's a question of whether or not should people have just gone for single payer or some kind of nationalized healthcare from the get-go, and has the Affordable Care Act helped or hurted? Sorry about that cough. Has it helped or hurted, or the pursuit for single payer? On the one hand, the odds of it's like that was a unique moment, and the moment happened, and then people are like, this is the best we can do, and this is the law that we passed, and like when is another significant moment for healthcare reform going to happen is unclear. But another interesting part of that, which I guess helps the perm argument, is that I don't know if this helps the perm argument or not, but people got mad. People are like, the Affordable Care Act hasn't been good. Obviously the Medicare for all and like the single payer conversation has become more mainstream, and a lot of people have been about it because of the failures of this incremental reform. So it's unclear. It's like it hasn't been the case where the ACA was a bridge that helped create a cumulative strategy where like, oh yeah, now we're going to go for single payer, because it was kind of like it was a very kind of American free markety kind of thing that was like those kind of things are. So doesn't fit in that kind of story, but it does demonstrate that like the fervor for broader, more transformative reform hasn't really changed. But and so the ACA, the failure didn't lower the fervor for reform. And so, but in this context, a lot of people are gonna, in the criminal justice context, there are certainly some kind of big starting points that you could say really challenge the logics of social control and punishment that don't necessarily abolish all prisons, that are super non-reformist potentially. But there's a lot of people are going to use that label just like, oh, we're a reform, And so of course we're like non-reformist, Like I think I heard some people doing that with the FISA AF the other day, which is kind of like not really what people are talking about in that context. And so there's a simple argument at the thrust, which is we shouldn't make the enemy the perfect the enemy of the good or anything. And there's a more nuanced conversation about movement tactics and how to sustain momentum and things of that nature that will involve the incrementalism debate. Mostly, affirmatives are going to talk about this. But even so far as, as the negative can crest its own argument if the AF is defending abolition in certain forms. The last thing I will talk about is a third kind of genre of way you can deal with this, which is specific impacts. And there's a couple of different things you can kind of try, because of federal policing has a lot of kind of very niche genres and niche areas. You can read different genres of impacts than things that are offshoots of the carceral state and social control. Trying to tackle one very small piece of, the carceral state or social control with a procedural reform, probably not the greatest way to insulate yourself from the abolition K. But talking about FISA and the intelligence community is an interesting example, and talking about the security exchange commissions or dealing with like insider trading is another kind of random example, dealing with the Coast Guard and things like that could be a little bit different. And kind of a corollary to this is kind of foreign policy style areas, maybe the way the death penalty impacts foreign relations and things like that in modeling. And the intelligence community, like FISA, for example, again, is a foreign policy style area. And, that kind of makes it, there's obviously, you're still prone to case, this is still debate, but it's not as straightforward as, you know, you kind of decriminalize all drugs, which is nice, but now you haven't bridged that divide between violent and nonviolent offenders. It still speaks to a theory of punishment, that you have a problematic way of dealing with people who have done violent offenses. You don't have a restorative way to do justice. We got to like pierce that divide because that's one of the main drivers of mass incarceration and things of that nature. Those themes are a little bit less easy in kind of the more niche specialized cases where, these foreign policy style impacts, if people are talking about terrorism or hegemony or things of that nature, people are going to have to adapt. The negative side, the critique side, is going to have to adapt a little bit more. And, you can kind of just rely on your generic timeless strategies of, we have specific impacts, the magnitude is really important. We're kind of just talking about two different things and things like that as a strategy. And that kind of brings us to the end here of our first deep dive into abolition versus reform. And we're going to be talking more about critical flavors that critique, that maybe say abolition doesn't go far enough, or definitely other ways to couch the critique of reform. And we're also going to, as we research more, we're going to figure out exactly how, and talk in more detail about the responses to abolition, both if you're a negative team and the AF said something abolitionist, and vice versa. And so this brings us to an end to this video. Thanks for watching, and we will talk more about this in lab.